Hello there, Steve here in Sydney. This is about pseudo-skeptics, and we've got the last couple of pieces in the puzzle on pseudo-skepticism, and I think this is going to interest you because there's a surprise outcome, a surprise piece in the jigsaw puzzle. And I'm going to talk to you about the two of the world's leading skeptics, and that is Christopher French and Richard Wiseman, who have both done something very peculiar. They both claim to be parapsychologists, advertise themselves, promote themselves as parapsychologists, that is, experts on telepathy. They both insist that telepathy doesn't exist, that it offends the fundamentals of science as we know it. They make that claim repeatedly over a period of years. And at the same time, they will tell you that all the evidence confirming telepathy is real is established by the best statisticians. They acknowledge it was known in 1950 telepathy was confirmed by the best, hardest science skeptical testing possible. So why do these two skeptics and a whole cluster of other public domain skeptics, why do they insist that despite all the evidence they are not going to believe it, and they demand more evidence? They say that it's an extraordinary claim, this telepathy, so you can't just use standard rules of evidence. You have to use extraordinary special rules for evidence where additional evidence has got to be piled on, and before you pile on all that extra evidence, they're not going to believe it, you see. So you've really got to ask the question, what are these people who promote themselves as parapsychologists doing? Admitting the evidence is there, but it just isn't good enough. It's good enough for a courtroom. It would score a conviction in a courtroom, but it's not good enough for them personally, because it would overturn the fundamentals of science as we know it, they always insist. That's the code phrase they use. I'm going to tell you about something. Chris Carter has written a couple of articles in the Epoch Times, and you can go and have a look at them, and they are fascinating. And he runs through the history of telepathy and science generally running side by side, and he says there's a couple of fascinating things that physicists are all very much happy to investigate, and in fact do confirm quite happily. Physicists happily confirm the obvious existence of telepathy. It's proven in thousands of studies over decades, over the last 100 years. It's well and truly proven, and ultimate tests that were beyond a shadow of a doubt were completed by 1950. So telepathy should have been established by then, and we could move on from those discoveries and keep going. But guess what? These pseudo-skeptics, in the mid-1950s, 1955, these people called pseudo-skeptics began insisting that the standard evidence isn't good enough. They want extra evidence, specially formulated for their personal requirements, which is remarkable for any scientist or person claiming to be a scientist to ask for. They want special evidence supplied to them personally, that standard rules of evidence shouldn't apply to telepathy. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, there's an explanation for this provided by Chris Carter. In the Epoch Times, Chris Carter makes the parallel between physicists who happily accept ESP and live with it because it makes a lot of sense with all the quantum physics and stuff they study today, that 97% of physicists accept telepathy as a done thing. It's all over, that's it, there's no argument, right? Only 3% are opposed to it, okay? And they're probably people who have never studied it seriously and don't have much interest in it. On the other hand, psychologists are radically different people to physicists. Physicists have a wonderful grasp of science. Psychologists don't. They do not understand science. They're actually science failures, maths and science failures at university. This was bemoaned by an eminent psychologist in 1968, a long time ago, Gardner Murphy, and he said that psychologists were bewildered by science, which surely must cause them to underperform, surely. Bewildered by science itself and the fact that physicists knew more about science and understood telepathy and happily coexisted with it a lot more than psychologists, who found it confronting and frightening. Now, here's the figures. 97% of physicists approve of ESP being obviously proven. Only 3% are opposed to it. Now, psychologists, it's quite the opposite, surprisingly different. 34% of psychologists insist telepathy is impossible. That's 11 times more than physicists. 11 times more psychologists insist. You got this? It's hard to take in, isn't it? 11 times more psychologists insist that telepathy is impossible, whereas physicists who do it in their spare time say it's A-OK, obviously normal, proven and fine. So what's the difference between psychologists and physicists? Well, I'm going to tell you now, and psychologists themselves aren't going to like this, but basically they fail maths and science at university. They got such low entrance marks to get into university, they can't do engineering, science, law, medicine. They just can't do it. Their entrance marks are just not good enough. So they are basically bottom feeders at university. But all they can do, which is the undemanding course called psychology, you don't need a high pass mark to get into that. So to prove you've been to university, you call yourself a psychologist, and it's mistakenly assumed it's a science, but it's not. Psychology is not a science. I'll come to that later. But psychologists, on the average, have a very poor grasp of science, yet set themselves up as experts on ESP, calling themselves parapsychologists. Specifically these two guys, Christopher French and Richard Wiseman, and they're almost certainly got a zero understanding of science. One of the code phrases that Christopher French, Susan Blackmore, Richard Wiseman, all the pseudoskeptics, Darren Brown, all these people claiming to be psychologists, parapsychologists, experts on telepathy, they spend their whole careers studying it and proving it doesn't exist. Now, what a strange career is that? And the code phrase they use, the duplicity, the subterfuge they're using is, science as we know it will be breached, undermined and trashed if we all start believing in telepathy, even though the evidence is compelling. And the answer is, science as they know it is quite different to how science you know it. You understand a smattering of quantum physics today. The general public do. They know about the fact that nothing is really separate from anything else, that everything seems to be connected. Physicists happily agree. Psychologists don't understand that because they still think in terms of, these parapsychologists, they still think in terms of pre-Einstein, pre-quantum, Victorian simplistic science, 19th century materialism, the world of gas lamps, the five senses and steam engines. That's science as we know it, according to these parapsychologists who've basically failed science at university and couldn't do higher learning. All they could do was psychology. So science as we know it is a code word for we're talking a totally different subject to you people, you average people who understand science out there. And that's how they can say, or they seem to say with utter conviction, that science as we know it is undermined, overturned by the reality of telepathy, so therefore it can't exist. But really it's a defect in their own heads, their own education. Science and maths is beyond them. It also points out some of the candid statements made by Susan Blackmore. She was an ace skeptic at CSI COP. She provides the definition of pseudoskeptics in the Wikipedia entry for pseudoskeptics. Look it up. She's in there describing them as dysfunctionally timid males who seriously underfunction and bully other people. That description is available to you in Wikipedia. Look it up. Mario Truzzi coined the phrase. It's not a new word, it's a 50-year-old word. Okay, it's in Wikipedia, have a look. But Susan Blackmore did a whole lot of ESP experiments, and she said that she could never duplicate other researchers' successful positive experiments for telepathy. She just could never get a result that was useful, you see. Well, now we know why, thanks to Chris Carter's revelations in the Epoch Times. Other people have gone through Susan Blackmore's telepathy data tables and found that there is in fact a positive signal proving telepathy in Susan Blackmore's data tables. But Susan Blackmore could never find them or see them because guess what? She couldn't do maths and science either. Sheer incompetence is what underpins their confidence, saying the lie that science as they know it will be undermined if we let telepathy through. We have to deny telepathy, otherwise science as we know it will be undermined and demolished. Well, not the case for modern scientific people, not the case for other disciplines like physics, right? Okay, they happily live with 97% of physicists happily accept ESP, but psychologists don't. Now, don't you find that a bit strange that psychology doesn't lead the charge into research into telepathy? Don't you think that's strange? Isn't it very, very strange? So now these people radicalise pseudo-skeptics on the internet, the vexatious social phenomenon that I'm sure you've all encountered. Online pseudo-skeptics are radicalised by this little ring of public domain skeptics, and the online skeptics torment religious people mercilessly, cruelly, and with completely empty criticisms. They're very vexatious people, insulting, abrasive people online, and they are cowardly and actually timidly dysfunctioning males typically, and they campaign and crusade very badly against afterlife, ESP, telepathy, and religion in particular. They have a grave hatred for religion. Now, the online social phenomenon that can make the internet so unpleasant, they are radicalised and led by this little ring of public domain skeptics that we've heard about, the Michael Shermers. I mean, he's another failure. Michael Shermer, who's amazingly a columnist in Scientific American, guess what his doctorate is in? Michael Shermer's qualification consists of a dissertation in 1991 of the history of science with a focus on evolution of man from reading the books of Alfred Wallace, a co-inventor of evolution with Darwin. Reading a few books doesn't really turn you into a scientist. It doesn't qualify you to criticise science generally. It gives you no grasp at all of scientific methods, surely. Yet he talks from the scientific high ground of Scientific American, and he's been caught out numerous times in television interviews by real life scientists, physicists and biologists and that sort of thing, and he makes criticisms without ever reading the studies that he's criticising, which is classic pseudo-skepticism. Doesn't want to know the subject, doesn't need to know the subject he's criticising. He simply has an output of criticism, which puts him in the public arena. He's in the limelight, basically, talking rubbish. So I'm hoping that this little discussion about Chris Carter's Epoch Times articles pointing out the peculiar psychology and mind makeup of these pseudo-skeptic ringleaders in the public domain that hang around with James Randi, that rules of evidence are useful, accepted in a court case in scientific endeavours around the world for hundreds of years, are just not good enough for these ringleaders that basically urge pseudo-skeptics online to go attacking religious people generally and proponents of ESP and telepathy. So I hope I've sketched for you here the apparent dysfunction of these parapsychologists who spend 40 years investigating something that doesn't exist, insist it doesn't exist, and then claim to have knowledge and be experts on the subject.